Hey everybody, this is Dirrick Butler. Hope that you guys are doing well today. Thank you all so much for tuning into our second Keeping It 110 event. As you guys know, during this COVID-19 pandemic, we are unable to be together in community. And these events have been really great for me just to continue to connect with folks and to really dive into some of the conversations that we would if we were together. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Today I'm super excited to be joined with someone who inspires me, the work that he does in advocating for students, advocating for people just across the board, Black folks who need to feel included, who need to feel safe, who need to feel like they belong. And I'm really just excited about our conversation that we're going to have today. For those individuals who are new, I just want to quickly do a quick just rundown of what Project OneTen is. So Project OneTen is an organization that we work every single day to ensure that Black and brown boys transition successfully into high school. We provide each student with a mentor, an academic coach, and pretty much walk alongside them as they transition into high school. One of the big things that we learned this past year was that we can't support and work with students if we aren't simultaneously supporting school leaders and teachers who are working with these students every single day. And that's where Keeping It 110 came about and came from. So we're really excited that you guys are joining us. We hope that you are sharing, liking, hearting, whatever you want to do. And we hope that this continues to grow throughout the evening. Before we jump into the conversation today, I want to highlight some of the additional speakers that we'll be having later on throughout the month for our Keeping It 110 events. So we're going to be talking with Dr. Mari Sweeney, who is the Chief Equity Officer for Chicago Public Schools. Dr. Christina, who is an amazing individual who works with the Erickson Institute. She also is a part of the Illinois State Board of Education. And then our last Keeping It 110 event that we're going to have are with two individuals that I'm really excited to talk with, Robert J. Hendricks and Tamisha Webb. These are great folks who are in Massachusetts doing amazing work to support young people. Robert founded an organization called He Is Me, which is an organization specific about how do we diversify and get Black male teachers working with our students. And Tamisha Webb is an amazing educator and the assistant principal at a charter school in Massachusetts. So excited to incorporate them into our conversations the remainder of this time. We hope that you guys are safe. We hope that you are healthy, that you are staying home and saving lives as our amazing mayor, Lori Lightfoot, continues to let us know. Y'all know how this goes. If you have a glass of wine, a drink, feel free. We're going to have a great conversation today. And once again, I am super excited to introduce to you guys to David John. So we're going to go ahead and bring him in and we'll get this conversation started. All right. What's up, David? How are you, sir? You are muted. We cannot hear you.
Oh, see, I followed your direction and muted myself and then unmute myself.
There we go.
I answered the question by saying that I'm tired. Aniana says you got to name a thing a thing. I'm posting to my Instagram story at Mr. David Johns a statement that I wrote today about the tragic death of Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old Black woman, an EMT in Kentucky who was murdered in her home by police serving a botched warrant. And this is the third statement like this that I've had to write in the last week, in part because Ben Crump, who was the attorney for the family, is a board member of NBJC, the organization that I have the pleasure of quarterbacking. And he also was involved in the Ahmaud Arbery case. And he also represents Nigel Shelby, who is on my shirt. And so I'm just tired. I'm tired of having to write these statements. I'm tired of having to talk about why we need to defend Black lives. And just thinking about your introduction, it should just simply be the case that Black people are allowed to be. Not all of the things that you use to describe our conditions. But that's not where we are. There's a lot of work to do. And as a result of it, I'm tired.
I totally get that. I think earlier this week or last week, there was a lot of conversation around the shooting in Georgia, and it is definitely one of those things. I think that you're tired of seeing, you're tired of hearing, but the importance of continuous having those conversations and sharing those stories, continuously saying those people's names. But as an educator, I think even for me, in one of the questions that I have for you later on, we'll talk a little bit about is how do we continue to have hope in situations like this? How do we continue to strive to shape our country and our society in a way that will truly respect and truly see our young people?
Yeah.
So that's definitely, I totally understand it. I appreciate your transparency because it is definitely tiring to continuously see. But for those who aren't well versed with who you are, David, of course, I've followed all the stuff that you're doing, but if you quickly could share just a quick biographical rundown, who you are, what do you do, and why do you do it?
Who I am an unapologetic Black feminist. I'm a child of God, the son of Edith, brother to Melinda, uncle to Jax, Jet, Jordan. By way of profession, I am a teacher, a speaker, and a writer. My formal career began in elementary school. I taught kindergarten and third grade in Harlem, New York, in a community that white people renamed Morningside Heights because it makes them feel more comfortable sending their children to a space that is literally less than 15 blocks away from the center of Harlem. And took a pay cut from teaching some time ago to pursue a fellowship with the Congressional Black Caucus that allowed me to use my educational experience, my experience in the classroom, and training as a researcher to develop and craft federal policy. So I spent nearly a decade on Capitol, primarily in the U.S. Senate, working on the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions as a senior policy advisor. And so I did that for Senator Ted Kennedy until he passed, God rest his soul. Was inherited by Tom Harkin. The Tea Party grew in sentiment and power and made the goal of passing bipartisan legislation impossible. So I quit my job, worked to get still my president, Barack Hussein Obama, and his fabulous wife, Michelle Yvonne Robinson Obama, reelected as a senior policy advisor to the campaign. And thereafter, I led an initiative that he established, the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. It still is one of 7 now initiatives focused on educational excellence in some way. Most people are familiar with the White House Initiative on HBCUs, which prior to the Obama administration was presumed to be responsible for the learning and development of all Black people, in spite of the fact that the 107 accredited HBCUs do a disproportionate share of providing post-secondary opportunities. They don't do that for all students, especially not those in pre-K-12 environments. So I did that until that was no longer an option. I almost got arrested by Secret Service trying to save files when the Trump administration was deleting web pages. And that led me to the job that I have now, which is leading NBJC. So for those who don't know, we're the nation's only civil rights organization that is both intentional and unapologetic in pursuing the intersections of racial justice and LGBTQIA plus equality. We understand that as long as there have been Black people, there have been Black queer people, which for me is significant because for almost a decade while I was on the Hill, whenever people lobbied on behalf of Black kids, they talked about them as if they were all heterosexual. And conversely, whenever GLSEN or HRC, for example, lobbied on behalf of queer kids and the issues that they face in schools, there was an assumption that they were all white. And so in the Obama administration, we hosted a summit for African American LGBTQIA plus youth to again remind educators that our babies show up with intersectional identities, right? Some of them might have disabilities that are hidden or invisible. Some of them might not be native English speakers or show up in lots of other interesting ways. And then really providing young people with opportunities to develop and design policies and practices to better meet their needs. So a lot of my work now and over the course of my career has just been anchored by equity and ensuring that adults who purport to care about children or adults who purport to care about Black people actually care about all of them, and particularly the least of these.
Thank you so much for sharing that. During this time, like of being at home during this COVID pandemic, I've been playing a lot of games, trying to like keep myself sane together. What has kind of been your way of staying good at home during this time?
What are my ways? So I have a strong village of friends, and some of them are licensed doctors and healers who check on me religiously. So everybody lean on your tribe in your village.
Yeah.
I also cycle, so I have a non-Peloton stationary bike that's connected to a virtual community through Harlem Cycle in Harlem, New York, which allows me to stay sane and work out energy that I need to. And also spend a lot of time talking to young people. I still regularly engage with students who often are not caught up in the things that make adults anxious.
Yeah, definitely. I think definitely speaking and remaining connected to like my students during this time has really helped me remain hopeful and positive during this time. But one of the things that we'll pivot back to some of the amazing work that you've done. But one of the games that I've played that's been really great is a game called We're Not Strangers. And it's a card game that you're able to play with people that you may know, may not necessarily know as well. And it's a great way to truly connect and get to know each other. So I would love to ask you a couple questions from this game.
Okay.
And the first question is, when was the last time that you surprised yourself?
When was the last time that I surprised myself? I'm laughing because I listened to Tokyo Vanity, who is a rapper from New Orleans, and she has a song with light skinned Keisha, and she says, "I'm never surprised by anything. Christmas is my favorite holiday." So there's a part of me that can't really think of having been surprised by anything as of late.
Okay.
Especially because I'm a Black queer man in America. So there are a few things that are actually surprising.
Understandable. Noted. Okay, so we'll go to the next question. Has a stranger ever changed your life?
Words matter, right? There's power in precision, and I don't know that I meet a lot of strangers, right? And in particular, I value people who I was reflecting upon some dates recently, and I dated a man in particular who like paid special attention to people in like service positions and who would otherwise be ignored by people, and that's really important to me. So I struggle with the concept of strangers. But yes, I think often about an encounter with a man who was experiencing housing insecurity. He was homeless in New York, who was struggling to capture the attention of people who were walking by him in a fairly busy section of an already busy city. And at some point, I watched him scream and get the attention of one, and he literally just said, "Hey, I just need you to notice me." And in an era where I think we're all being reminded that we are literally only as healthy as the least of those amongst us.
Yeah.
That encounter stays with and informs the way that I show up in the world, and I hope will, by extension, and the way that we're experiencing COVID as a global community, also affect the way that more privileged people, people who we might call essential, but otherwise show up in invisible ways in our lives.
Definitely. I agree. I think similar to it's hard to kind of like a stranger, because I feel like I typically am able to connect and meet new people very easily, and oftentimes in ways similar to like this game that like connects us, where people don't feel like strangers, because similar to what you were saying, when you meet people, I feel like oftentimes I look for similar qualities of folks that I know, right? So whether that's somebody who's serving me at like a restaurant, may remind me of like a cousin or remind me of an aunt. So I definitely agree with that. Last one, what title would you give this chapter in your life?
What title would I give this chapter in my life? Amel Larue is one of my favorite singers, and she has a song that I love titled Infinite Possibilities, so I will go with that.
Okay. Cool. I'll also add, in this game, there is a clear card that says dig deeper. I would say I would love to hear more about that, but for interest of time, we'll continue on.
I just say in short that I'm embracing that this crisis is allowing for disruption and innovation. And there are a lot of people in particular, a lot of my privileged friends and colleagues who find themselves saying that they want to rush back to what was normal. And I often remind them that that's the exact opposite of what I want in this moment, because normal didn't really work for us, right? Again, acknowledging that most people I know are struggling with very public reminders of lynchings of Black bodies that are as familiar to us as songs that many of us learned when we were children, right? And so for me, right now, not only is there, I listen to Jill Scott and Erykah Badu and watch them love on each other. And in the beginning of all things, most things that we owe in terms of our joy, we owe to Black women. But there's a point early on where Jill Scott said she hadn't been as home for as long as she had been in 20 years. And I have made a lot of sacrifices to enjoy what many people call professional success, including moving. And so there's a very personal part of this experience for me that has allowed me to be even more reflective than I already am as an educator. I'm hyper reflective. I'm a Pisces Aquarian, so I'm emotive and hyper reflective as well. And so I'm thinking a lot about my own family and children and things like that. But then there are also opportunities for me to think about shifts in work, right? For teachers who otherwise wouldn't make space for the social and emotional development of children before now, talking about the inability to prioritize students retaining content over their emotional well-being now has allowed for there to be some really important shifts. And so in all ways, I just think that there are infinite possibilities. So, and Amel Larue is dope. If you don't know her, you should download her music. Most people know her because she sang with Groove Theory. But I love her. If anyone knows her, send her this and tell her that I love her.
Cool. Thank you for going deeper. I love that, because I think too, like, I've been really thinking more about, we're in this space now that seems very different. But I truly believe that this is like a reset. Like it's not an opportunity for us to be like, let's go back to normal, specifically for schools. I think that we're learning a lot and seeing a lot that hopefully, as you were saying, will inform us on how we have to do things differently when we return back, and reimagine, have those infinite possibilities, and not be so beholden to how things were. Because as you said, they weren't working. So thank you for sharing that.
For us, to be clear, they were working for some, right? Some of these systems, like schools, work exactly as designed for some,
yep.
A privileged minority. But for us, for the people that I care about, not so much.
That is so true. So true. Let's go back to like your first question I asked, where we were talking just kind of about like your journey, like things that you've done. And in doing like some research preparing for this, learned that being a teacher, being in education, wasn't necessarily something that you wanted to do or had any inkling that like that would be a field that you would be interested in. So, what inspired you to be an educator?
Yeah, I think that you found me at some point saying that I describe my experience as a teacher as reluctant, is probably the word that I use. And to be clear, that is less a reflection of it not having been something that was nascent in my life or present, right? Like I'd always worked with young people, right? My freshman year at Columbia, I volunteered at an entrepreneurial camp in Grass Valley, California. For example, I worked with A Better Chance and tutored kids in Harlem while a student in New York, right? And so that was always present. But as a first generation college graduate at Columbia University, as a Black boy from Inglewood, California, literally telling people that I desired to be an educator was not met with the type of celebration that I get now, having worked for the first Black president as an educator, right? In an era where being a nerd now a bit more sexy because of him and other examples like it. But in fact, when I said to my boys senior year that I was going to teach, they called an intervention and asked me what was wrong with me, right? We live in a country where for Black men that graduate college, teaching is the number one profession, but it is not the thing that we value. To the previous point, there is a shift happening now because, to be clear, parents are a child's first and most important teacher. They are like teachers, they are not educators, right? To be an educator, to do God's work in a formal way requires a different set of skills and capacities and compassions. And a lot of people, a lot of parents are being forced to appreciate that in this moment, whether or not the fact that most people have short memories will mean that that won't last through the next Teacher Appreciation Week next year is a question that has yet to be answered. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it was not easy for me as a Black man who was really clear about the sacrifices people made so I could enjoy opportunities to, for example, attend Columbia University and show out while there, work in the White House for, again, still my president, right? Like, have a job that is at the nexus of the place where my purpose meets my passion, right? Like, also being clear about that responsibility made it very difficult for me to think about teaching. And so me teaching kindergarten was literally an act of God. Was him saying to me, are you going to be still and do the thing that you continue to run from? In part because other things that I tried to do were not options for me at that point in time. And so it was a reluctant journey, but it was one that nonetheless I am glad to have embraced.
Yeah, when you mentioned teaching kindergarten, one of my friends, Chanel, here in Chicago, taught pre-K. And I feel like if anything is God's work, I mean, teaching pre-K, kindergarten. I taught middle school and for a year. It was like, please, I just want to go to high school. So power to you all for being able to truly be present in a different way. You know, like teaching kindergarten is that truly is a calling. So I'm curious, like, to hear how you went from teaching, or how that led to you being and serving in the Obama administration.
Yep.
Just kind of like what that journey looked like for you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I will tell the story, but I want to be clear because this came up for me in a conversation yesterday with a really good friend, Naomi Shelton, who's on the public charter authorizing board in D.C. There's a danger in how these conversations are had because it's going to sound linear in hindsight. And it's going to sound really simple and ordered and strategic, and it wasn't always that way.
Yeah.
And so for folks, in particular students who might be watching this, in particular who are thinking about what the pandemic will mean for their career options, know that a lot of what I did was three things. One, be really clear about my purpose and my passion, right? My mother would always say, "Are you happy?" And I think too often Black folks are not allowed to ask themselves what makes them happy, especially if we're in positions to be able to benefit from privilege. Two is taking calculated risks. Again, teaching elementary was a calculated risk. Taking a pay cut from teaching elementary school to be a fellow in DC, right, was a calculated risk, right, was the second one. And then the third was also just being true to myself, right? So that as a disclaimer, as a framing, I, while teaching, was really struggling with the reality that, one, I was an isolated minority, right? I was one of three total Black men, Black male teachers in the building. I was the only classroom teacher. One of my colleagues taught art. Another of my colleagues taught PE, right? Important, not classroom subjects, important. And in kindergarten, out of 56 kids, there was not a single Black boy, right? And so I'm now having to start initiatives to get teachers and parents and families to go out and identify Black families who might want to apply to attend this independent school in New York, and forced to think about the relationship between policy and practice, especially as it often mediated or moderated access to opportunity for Black kids or poor kids. And at the time, everybody and their mama was talking about No Child Left Behind. And so I was in graduate school at the time. It was often reflected on as the panacea and the solution to all of the problems that we have faced heretofore. And after an argument with a really privileged white woman who said to me that we needed to accept incremental change, I decided to take a pay cut to move to DC to figure out whether or not policy could actually be leveraged to our benefit. And so I then spent nearly a decade often seated next to individuals with tremendous power, Charles Rangel, Ted Kennedy, Tom Harkin, Barack Obama. Thereafter, I worked for President Clinton as an undergraduate student at Columbia, but really being a conduit, setting a table and pulling out chairs for individuals affected by policies to articulate how those policies were affecting them before groups of exceptionally privileged white people who got to craft policies with no intimate knowledge of how they would affect people in their lives. And then finding ways to leverage things like Twitter before it was sexy for staffers who were often thought of as shadows to their principals to otherwise communicate things that were happening in Capitol Hill or in the White House to individuals who would never watch The West Wing, who could give two shits about who was on CNN or MSNBC, but otherwise need to know why it's important for them to vote, not because people died, while that is important, but because elections have consequences as we're experiencing now.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up the fact that it was not a linear trajectory. One of my mentors always says when you ask someone a question about their journey, if it is just this constant move up, and there's no, weird movements or mishaps or trials or issues that, that they don't talk about those just as equally as they talk about those triumphs, then it really does give this false, narrative of, I knew what I wanted to do and bam, I hit it. No, there are those things that happen. So thank you for bringing that up. But I'm curious, working at that level, specifically Capitol Hill, in the White House, what did this experience teach you about three things? Our country, the education space on a macro level, and then yourself. Here's those three things, and then how those potentially intertwine with each other.
Yeah. What did that teach me about the country, about education, and about myself? So let me be clear that the most challenging job that I've ever had was being a kindergarten teacher. Both the most challenging and the most rewarding job I had was being an elementary school teacher. And in fact, perfecting classroom management skills with kindergartners allowed me to be able to be an effective policy negotiator in the U.S. Senate. Particularly at the time when the Tea Party started to become an actual thing. And so I say that again because again, part of what happens in these conversations is that the thing that gets celebrated and that's sexy is the White House experience. But my White House experience would not have been possible or meaningful if it was not always accessed through the lens of how things in that space affected my babies and their families, and again, communities who otherwise wouldn't be able to experience it. That having been said, my time in DC and on the Hill taught me about education three things. One, that power works in peculiar ways, and that the traditional system of public education in the United States is a fairly recent invention. And I think most people forget to appreciate that it exists alongside an independent and private school system that not only reflects existing I want to say racism. I got a yalla in my head talking about just racism, but it really does reflect how institutional racism works, right? And that public schools are designed to select and sort students into existing classes and jobs, right? Again, something that is being shifted in this very moment, but that is often hidden behind policy speak or teachers' use of jargon to otherwise obfuscate the reality that systems work exactly as designed.
Yeah.
What it taught me was that I am obligated to, in the words of Manny Marable, a professor I had at Columbia University, speak full truth to power, especially in the moments when it shakes my soul. So most of my life, I have often been the only one in the room, right? As a student, I would take a bus an hour from my house in Inglewood, my apartment in Inglewood, to be clear. Shout out to Issa Rae. To Brentwood, our Paul Revere, Pacific Palisades, California. I was one of two, and then the only Black man in the U.S. Senate as a professional staffer for nearly 8 years. I am the only Black man who leads a national organization at the intersections of civil rights and LGBTQ equality, right? Like, so much of my experience has been a test in and a testament to talking about the things that I know to be true, being really clear about leveraging what people call passion when they're trying to be nice, which is my sort of insistence on not allowing people to get away with shit that they've gotten away with heretofore, especially if it's not in the best interest of our babies. And otherwise leading in ways that I know are important. I spent a number of years, too many years, and I care to count, in DC, expecting to have people who were more senior and more experienced and had more access to things tell me what our community needs and what we should be doing. And especially in the time that I had leading the White House Initiative and working with folks like John King and Arnie Duncan, and a number of public servants who are still trying to do right by people in spite of this current administration, that job was really a reminder that I need to do the things that I know to be true, and that while I do that, I'm going to piss some people off, that in particular, people that I'm advocating for aren't always going to get it, and sometimes we'll get it and won't be on the side of right and righteous. And then in spite of that, I'm obligated to do the work that I'm purposed to do.
Yeah. So in kind of like being in, this is a question I didn't even write down, but was brought up as you were speaking. There's this quote that someone, I can't remember who said it, but it's like, what's the purpose of you having a seat at the table if, like, once you get to that table, you act like, you don't eat your chicken the same way that.
Yeah, I'm sure with some Black woman that said it.
Right. So how does one find that, right? Because oftentimes when you get to those spaces, and even in the Becoming documentary, Michelle Obama was talking about when you get to the table, you realize that, like, people aren't as smart as you think they are. But how do you, as the only or a young professional, someone who, is there, you're excited to be there and excited to do the work, find that confidence and find that like passion to speak up, as you were saying, speak truth to power, advocate for those people who are on your block in Inglewood, who you saw that were impacted by the lack of responsibility that these folks have. Where did you find that?
I don't know that I found it so much as I appreciate that it has always existed, right? My mother's birthday was May 8th. And I just posted recently a reflection on how much that I get from her. My mother's a fighter, right? She was an advocate before I knew what the word meant, right? I had a teacher, for example, a substitute teacher, who tried to make fun of me when I acknowledged that we had homework that was due. I was that kid in school. If I did the work, I wanted credit for it. And this particular teacher made fun of me and, like, you know, spent time trying to embarrass me publicly. I called my mother and I was transferred within a week, right? I went to a high school that was fairly affluent in a suburb in Pacific Palisades, California. And my guidance counselor did not want to allow me to register for more than 3 AP classes. And I knew, in part because I had taken an AP class in middle school, right, that to be competitive, this is something that I had to do. My mother came up to the school with the attorney from the Johnny Cochran firm, right? Like, she is not afraid of a fight, especially if it is about her babies. And that's been clear to me. So that's one, right? I also am a Black boy man now. I often think about myself as a student, but I grew up in Inglewood, California, right? I did well in school. I was a mama's boy. I was always tall. I had curly hair, nice teeth, right? Like, I learned to fight early on because I'm in the category of folks that's likely to be tested, and my mama didn't raise no punk, right? And so that's also a part of my experience. And I have been lucky enough to be a student of so many people who have leveraged our collective experience as Black people. I think a lot about Uncle Jimmy James Baldwin. There's a picture of him looking at me now. But him describing what it means for us to live and almost always be in a constant state of rage. I now have literal language, right? Access to multisyllabic words as well as cuss words and a couple of other tools to be able to articulate the feelings that I have. And I have literal access to spaces, right? Like, I have the ability to engage with leaders of legacy civil rights organizations or national LGBTQ groups or grassroots organizations that work in community, or members of Congress or elected officials, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is this isn't so much of me acknowledging that I think all of us are obligated to adopt something that exists externally, but we really have the opportunity to accept the gifts that have been given to us. The question is, are you going to use them, right? The last thing I'll say to this that just came to me is that Dr. King has a sermon, but if not, the title of it, and essentially he's talking about the fact that so many people have this kind of faith in God, literally, that has to be tested, right? That is, I will do these things if you show up and do this for me. I will no longer sin if you show up and deliver me. And what he talks about is that, like, at every point in somebody's life, you will be tested in a way that's going to make you uncomfortable, right? That will literally require you to stand by yourself, be castigated by your friends, literally to prove that the things that you're purposed to do will be done. And most people choose not to do them. Right? They die a literal and figurative death in that moment. And what he urges us is to have the kind of faith, which is to say that if God never shows up and doesn't do a single thing, I'm going to do the things that I know that have been purposed for me to do. And to go back to something you said earlier, right? Like, the space we're in now is tough. I find it hard to again, think about chronology and how it's often problematic as a construct. But, like, the trauma associated with our experience as Black people, right, or those of us connected to the diaspora in America, has always been fraught with tension and trauma and visceral pain. That's just not going to change, right? Dirrick Bell, critical race theorist, one of the fathers of critical race theory, offers up radical realism, racial realism. And it literally is us acknowledging that racism, as problematic and as powerful a construct as it is not going to go away in our lifetime, right? And us trying to think that we're going to shift things and leverage institutions like the law or the medical industrial complex or education, public education in particular. Again, institutions that have been designed to flatten blackness and to maintain marginalization and oppression are not going to suddenly shift, right? Like power doesn't work in that way. Nobody's going to concede things in an era where interests have to converge in order for that kind of shift to actually be real.
Yeah.
So what he says is that like we can accept that and then imagine in the ways that like Octavia Butler and James Baldwin and other people have invited us to think about how we might show up given that reality. Right. And so some of this for me, again, to your point about renewal is we just got to sit in this. And too often we are able to push past the pain, not want to sit in the discomfort of not knowing or knowing. And right now, literally, everybody's forced to be on timeout.
Yeah.
The question is, will we retreat and go back to doing that which we've always done? Or will we dig in and try and shift in ways that will allow for some reimagining?
Yeah. Yeah. A couple of things. I think for me, kind of really going off of what you were saying, totally agree. My mom, my grandmother, if anything happened at school, they were there, right? So I think from a very early age, similar to you, like I knew like I needed to speak up, I needed to use my voice. But I think even now as I am thinking about my career now, it's often scary to see and hear. If I was not in this room, what would you all walk out and the decision be? Right? If I wasn't there to truly shed light on like what's really going on, how we truly are perpetuating the craziness of the system, like would we really continue to just do the status quo and harm more students? So I think that just it affirmed to me the importance of using my voice, the importance of shedding light on students who people in power may not necessarily see, have similar experiences about. So I totally agree with that. My second point I want to transition to, you talked a little bit about yourself growing up, kind of being the person who oftentimes you got tested. There were situations where you had to
get tested.
learn, right. Situations where you had to like understand who you were, your power. I'm curious, like as we think about, and you said this yesterday on an Instagram live conversation that you had. When we think about students currently in school, educational spaces, oftentimes there are a lot of students who feel that very same feeling, right? They feel like the other, they feel bullied, if not by students, by teachers, people making sly comments, things. And right now, or at least yesterday in the conversation, the lady that you were speaking to said that her son is thriving right now because he's not having to deal with a lot of the violence, if you will, mental, physical, structural violence that takes place in educational spaces.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like in your role, when we think about, the Obama administration creating this Office of Educational Excellence for African Americans, I hope I said that right. How did you experience, affirm, and advocate for the intersection of multiple identities, right? Like as a Black boy, we're not just all one way. We all have very different experiences. We all identify in different ways. How did you take your role, specifically when it comes to Black boys, to experience? How did you experience and affirm and advocate in your work?
I appreciate that. So you referenced yesterday, shout out to Feminista Jones, Michelle Taylor, who talked about her son Garvey, who's 13. And what she said is that he's a Black boy who likes the Beatles, and he plays the bass. And so in Philly, that invites bullying because, again, often students are not in spaces with educators that affirm celebrating difference and diversity.
Yeah.
And so students are often pushed out of community when they can't find people who look like them or affirm their experience. And so, yeah, she said that. The thing that has always been important for me, very much related to the previous point, is acknowledging and accepting that students that are most sensitive, who are most attuned to what's going on around them, who are most aware of what people expect of them or don't expect of them, what adults should be doing for them and often are not doing, are the first ones to get pushed out of educational spaces, or the spaces that they're forced to otherwise be in, right? That's a truism. I say that to remind any adult who shows up in spaces where you are a teacher or do direct service work with young people to know that if you are not going to speak up when young people cannot, then you should not be in that space. You literally need to move. Like, find another profession, because young people don't have the option, but you can choose to be elsewhere, right? Like, that's one part of this. The second part, and to answer your question about how like this shows up in my own practice, is that my job is not to speak for people who have a voice. My job is not to articulate my experience as if it is the only experience of an incredibly diverse group of people. My job is to provide space for people to be seen and respected as the experts that they are. And so my job in the White House was primarily to provide a stage for young people to be acknowledged and celebrated as experts. And so we produced a series of summits. It was a partnership with Ebony Magazine, Johnson Publishing Company, which doesn't exist anymore in that way. And we went around the country to a number of colleges and schools and hosted summits, right? Literally these community events that were designed to do three things. One was to give a platform to young people. The one rule that was a non-negotiable is that the only experts who get to talk were students, some as young as 5, all the way up through non-traditional college age adults, right? But you had to be a student, right? The second goal was to allow Black people with disabilities, Black LGBTQ students, right? We were really intentional in highlighting and calling out gaps that are a result of people not interrogating the way that Blackness is often flattened by design, right? And so we created a record that people could go back to, not only to understand the diversity that exists within our community, but so that people who were members of those intersectional groups within the community could also then make connections not only with each other, but with federal resources that they otherwise should have had access to in the first place, right? And then the third thing was really just to celebrate and affirm people who had always been doing that work, right? So I was clear when I was appointed by President Obama that the job was going to end on a particular date, right? There was at some point the hope that another Democrat would have allowed us to continue that work, but that job and opportunity was always term limited. The job also came after and as a result of people working in community, right? I think often in Chicago in particular about G2 Brown, right? Who has been doing advocacy and organizing work for longer than a lot of people have been alive, right? And so my job was really to leverage the fact that we had a Black president and a first lady, right? There's a literal Obama effect, right? I could show up in a space and literally say their names and watch people, grown-ass adults, get excited, right? And so my job was really to celebrate folks such that they would know that it was important for them to continue to do that work, including moments like now when you have people like Betsy DeVos, who knows nothing about public education, responsible for the institution of public education in this country.
Yeah, the first Keeping It 110 event we spoke with Dr. Cesare Warren, and one of the things that he wrote about.
Shout out to Cesare. Read his books, read his articles. I saw you tweet it before we started. Good dude.
Yeah, that's my homie. One of the things that I really loved about in his book, where he talks about brotherhood, I'll take the liberty and say community, right? So like brotherhood or community means very little. And we think about what schools are trying to build, educational spaces are trying to build amongst teachers and students and wanting people to feel welcome, that it means very little if you feel excluded for not adhering to the code, right? Even if you never outwardly express those feelings. So when we think about and transitioning now to the work that you're doing with the National Black Justice Coalition, specifically with LGBTQ students and people, how do we create and hold space in schools that see, affirm, and are making those necessary adjustments to ensure that everyone feels a part of this community and that people aren't silently dealing with the violence of being in a space that was created to kind of, well, I won't say it was created, but it's supposed to be, right, helping them grow and develop. What does this look like? How do we create those spaces?
So it's not, right? So I think first is acknowledge it, let's say name a thing of things. Public schools in America are not designed to support people learning and developing.
Yeah.
Period, right? That is why people that have privilege, e.g. money, buy suburban public schools or pay for privileged private schools or boarding day schools so that their kids not only thrive cognitively, but have access to social and emotional development opportunities and resources. Mm-hmm. Period, full stop.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that there are three things that schools could and should be doing. One is, as I mentioned already, talking about the plurality of diversity that exists in our country. Mm-hmm. Some of this is embedded and reflected in language. We should stop calling Black and brown kids minorities when technically they are the majority. We should stop calling Black women a minority when they are a global majority, right? We should be more mindful of talking about the way that science and conflict within science allows for us to make sense of things that otherwise don't make sense, right? One of those in particular being that most of us are more similar than we are dissimilar, in spite of the languages, our countries of origin, or disability status, or otherwise experiences that we have, housing, food insecurities, whatever. Most of what makes us who we are biologically, physiologically, emotionally is more similar than it is dissimilar.
Yeah.
And so talking about that and creating space to celebrate diversity of experience and ways of making meaning is critically important to ensuring that kids understand diversity and not just eschew it as a word that they're over, because people continue to use it and don't know what it means. The other thing that's really important for me right now in my work, especially as it relates to students, is just attending to their mental health and well-being. Again, not something that schools are designed or equipped in this moment to do, right? But it is something that they are responsible for in a world where, again, to be Black in America is to almost always be in a constant state of rage. To be Black and woke is a horrible damn combination, especially for a young person in a classroom environment with a white person who is empowered and not principled. And so finding ways to respond to the mental health needs of young people that often otherwise go neglected and ignored is incredibly important. For me right now, that is reducing stigma, right? So in the same way that we try and normalize conversations about queer things in the Black community, whether it's health status or dating, we also have to normalize mental health and address the fact that there's still stigma associated with counseling, right? You can go to the doctor or go to the altar on Sunday, but you should also be able to go to a doctor through the week, right? So that's a lot of the work. The other thing that I'm mindful of now is that often people, especially young people, who need access to competent and quality mental health care often can't afford it or don't have the space in order to access it. And so we're doing a lot of work now and trying to highlight resources. Shout out to Therapy for Black Girls and Crystal, Kid Fury, and the Read, among them as spaces for people to be able to dig into. It's 7 in New York, which means that it's shift change, so it's going to get real loud in a second as people celebrate service workers who are on the front lines.
Gotcha. I definitely
I can't hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you now. What are you saying?
I was saying, I think with in our last conversation with Cesare, we talked a lot about this space and how do we create it, right? And you talked about that. But one of the questions that came up specifically was teachers truly not knowing where to begin, how to understand, how to build a space with potentially things that they may not themselves agree with. I'm curious to hear your thought, like on as an educator, the difference or the line between your job of creating space and creating a community versus believing or not believing or understanding or not understanding
Yeah,
a
gotcha.
person's diversity. Yeah,
Yeah, so I don't, again, words matter, and use the term agree. I don't need you to agree with a single thing about the way that young people show up in your classroom. If you cannot otherwise meet their individual needs for cognitive, social, and emotional development and support, then you need to choose another damn profession. Period. Full stop.
yeah,
In the same way that I don't care if you agree with my life partner or the way that I will raise a family or the way that I will curse while delivering a dress. The work is not in one agreeing with, right, because we should disagree, we should accept that we're going to disagree with a lot of things or not know a lot of things.
yeah,
The work is really in you understanding that you have accepted a responsibility to meet the needs of the children that don't have a choice about whether or not they show up in front of you. That is a foundation. Students cannot be expected to back up. Again, I talk about love of words. The Latin root of the word education is educare. It literally means to draw out. We know that the process of taking the kinds of risks that learners have to make in order to demonstrate what they know and learn new concepts is not going to happen if students don't feel safe.
yeah, yeah,
It is the reason why students who attend schools that have metal detectors and police officers and dogs in them have lower achievement rates, right? You are not going to feel safe in a space where you're worried about your physical safety,
yeah,
right? It is also true that you are not going to feel safe learning in an environment where teachers are not supportive of your identity, orientation, experience, ways of making meaning, and whatever that means.
yeah.
And so I want adults, again, who have choice and agency, out of this very privileged feeling of needing to feel like they understand something in order to respond to it or to meet a critical need. I literally have no patience for helping adults appreciate that that is not the work. The work is in providing now virtual and at some point physical environments where young people with all of their stuff feel safe, affirmed, and supported. And again, if you don't want to do it, say so. I'm all about people being real clear about their limitations.
Yeah.
Teaching is not for everybody.
Yeah.
And students will tell you that. But move, find another job.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I think what you were saying. That is your job. Like that's what you're supposed to do, whether you like it or not, whether you agree or not. Every student deserves to feel safe, seen, and affirmed in a space where they can thrive. And I think I'm a firm believer that academic achievement, success, growth, all these buzzwords will come. But if your community, if the space that students come to every single day is not a space where they feel safe, as you were saying, academics is not going to happen. And I think that goes back to this conversation around being culturally responsive, right? Culturally responsive doesn't necessarily mean race, right? Throwing in some like hip hop songs, adding a different type of whatever to what you're doing. It's about how are you meeting the needs?
Yeah.
How are you meeting those needs and how are you responding? And that is important first before we even get to figure out what 1+1 or whatever type of academic stuff is.
Yeah.
The next point I want to talk a little bit about is, and then we'll open it up for questions, is some would say, and for those who are watching, definitely feel free to type in your questions in the comment section. If there's something that you want to hear a little bit more about, ask a question specifically, and I'll go through the comment to ask the questions you may have. But one of the really big things I've seen and have grown really frustrated with about school specifically, I love this highlight, this specific point of language being important, right? Some would say that the many challenges and inequities that Black and brown boys face can be self-mitigated through, and these are just, put on a tie, pull up your pants, wear your hair a certain way, or even through racially coded terms. demonstrating grit, self-control, responsibility, hard work, and so on. Which we know in society today that these will not save anyone, right? Where and how should schools refocus their efforts in impacting both the academic and professional success of young men of color?
Okay, great question. Before I do that, I want to go back to the previous question and offer up some resources for folks that want to do the necessary work of struggling through
Love that.
their own field. So one is Yolanda Sealy Ruiz is a mentor, professor at Columbia University. She has a new book, Love from the Vortex, but she also talks about critical humility as a pedagogical practice that teachers in particular can practice and employ really to check their own privilege and biases, to hold space to then do work of the work required to be culturally responsive. So that's one, Yolanda Sealy Ruiz. The second is Chris Emden, again, Teachers College. Chris wrote the book for white folks that teach in the hood and all of the rest of y'all, and in particular uses hip hop pedagogy, not as again, as you described, a way for white folks to think about playing Lauryn Hill to speak to kids, but as a way to understand the language matters, and that teachers have to do the job of understanding the language that their students speak in order to be able to engage with them fluently. So his book is the second one. Bettina Love has also written a book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. And for me, it provides a number of reflections of her experience as a teacher for people seeking to make these critical connections, to acknowledging that teaching, in particular teaching Black babies, is political, and that as a result, educators and other caring and concerned adults have an obligation to be engaged in the work of education reform. And then the last one is Lance T. McCready. Lance's work is really about safe spaces for LGBTQ students in schools. His work is really important because a lot of folks will say, you know, we have a GLSEN chapter at our school. The queer kids are fine. And what Lance helps us to appreciate is that race and sexual identity, orientation, and expression work in separate, but sometimes, shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectional ways. And so for students in schools in particular who are Black and LGBTQIA, they're often forced to choose. You can either be Black and go to the BSO meeting and seek refuge there, or you can go to the gay meeting and seek refuge with the queer kids. And so again, it is an acknowledgement that educators have to create spaces where kids can show up as their full selves because they can't separate themselves no more than we as adults can. So that as resources. With regard to Black men and boys, I think in threes, if you can't tell, there are at least three things that we should be doing. One is appreciating, again, that there is no one way to be a Black man or boy, right? The tropes that used to exist where you had James Baldwin or Alvin Ailey as the performative queer a feminine version of masculinity on one end of the spectrum, and a hyper-masculine Eldridge Cleaver, Medgar Evers on the other end of the spectrum, is one of the ways that white supremacy wins, right? And teaching us that we don't show up with beautiful diversity and complexity. And so we all have to acknowledge that and celebrate that and allow for there to be queer possibilities with a capital Q. That's one. The second thing is that, especially within our community, we have to do a better job of acknowledging that boys, especially young boys who we sometimes push through the period of being babies, which is why I talk a lot about teaching the babies, because there's a way that we sometimes think about protecting and coddling and nurturing babies that we don't do for Black boys who are forced to grow up and be men often before they should. Right, so there's a way that we should be more mindful about development, and the reality that young boys need to be reminded that they have emotions and should be able to name them, and have access to resources to work through experiencing them, often in ways that Black men and boys are not able to access, experience, or name. Right. And then the third thing is that Black men and boys, especially students, need more opportunities to win.
Yeah.
It is too often the case. And again, I think about the sad reality that Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Trayvon Martin, all would be 26 years of age this year if they had the opportunity to live, right? I'm thinking about Nigel, who I carry with me, who would be 16. He would have turned 16 in February of this year, a couple of weeks before my birthday. Nigel died by suicide because he was bullied for being black and gay in Alabama, a state in the country where it's not okay to be either black or gay, let alone both at the same time, right? I'm saying all of this, and I'm holding on to our boys and our babies, because we need to allow them to win and create spaces for them to be celebrated for being black boys like Garvey, who like the Beatles and otherwise know good music.
Right.
Boys like Nigel, who learned his colors because of his love for Beyonce and all things beautiful in the world. Shout out to the Hive, right? Like providing space for black boys to dazzle and be brilliant. Very much related to that, I encourage everybody to pick up George Johnson's new book, All Boys Aren't Blue, right? Which again, I think speaks to what we're talking about. Michael Arsenault, one of my brothers who I've known for decades, has written now 2 books. The first book is I Can't Date Jesus. The last one is I Don't Want to Die Poor. And then Darnell Moore has also written a book, No Ashes in the Fire, that for me, each of them, you're going to go pick them up and show me you have them, right? Each of them, yeah, George's book, love it, right? But each of them, to me, not only reflect the rich legacy of folks like Uncle Jimmy and Aunt Octavia and others, but they're also speaking to the experiences of our babies now.
Yeah, definitely. I have this book, the book that he was just talking about, All Boys Aren't Blue. I read just a little bit of it, and immediately, in imagining the students and the boys that are at our school and at schools across the country who are internally dealing with so much, right? And come to spaces, as you were saying, that like they aren't able to win. Like there's just this mental violence, physical violence, structural violence. And I think that as Black people and people of color, leading schools and leading these educational spaces have an obligation to truly create those spaces. And I think that it's really disheartening when you see our people who find themselves being complacent and find themselves sticking with the status quo because it's easier than to disrupt and create those safe spaces. And that actually takes me to the first question.
See, but before we go there, I want to push you. And we can go a little bit longer. I do have to run like at 7:45 because I got to jump on for Ben Crump.
Cool.
Because we're going to talk about some of these cases. But I think that we have to appreciate that while there are no lay people in the world ensuring Black liberation, each of us have a lane. And I think sometimes it's easy for us to think that it's easier to maintain the status quo, and it's not, right? Like, again, I go back to Dirrick Bell and the principle around radical racial realism. Simply existing as a Black person in America, in spite of all of the ways that racism and poverty and capitalism and all these other institutions are designed to crush us, is sometimes just enough. And not all of us are equipped, able, protected, whatever the word is, able to show up in these public ways, right? I had a parallel but irrelevant. I had a conversation yesterday with somebody about the term inviting in. I hate the phrase coming out. It's problematic. For me, it reflects how heteronormativity and privilege works. Straight people don't have to come out, short version of it. And I was trying to help the person who was struggling with this concept really understand that, like, I'm not supposed to be able to exist in the world and have a job and exist in ways that I'm able to say I am unapologetically proud to be Black and same gender loving.
Yeah.
But I can't do that such that other people don't have to take on this work, so that they can just be, right? And so I'm pushing again because we got to give each other grace. And we also have to appreciate that there are many more lanes in this work of trying to move toward collective, full, intersectional liberation.
So, so at what point when we have individual, I totally get it, right? Like, one, having grace with each other. We all have different roles to play in different lanes that we are in. I was a part of this fellowship led by Carmita Saman, the Surge Institute, where she talks about you have the orchestrators, you have the protesters, you have these different levels of people, and everyone should be okay with where they are. But at what point do you challenge or push someone who is upkeeping the status quo that is then in terms harming others, right? Like, yes, we want to have grace. Yes, we understand like your lane. But at this point, students are being harmed. Like students.
Right.
So how do
Right.
you do that?
The position for me is around upkeeping the status quo. So what I'm talking about is uh, people who are simply surviving, right? The mothers like my sister who have 3 children, and not the support of men who help to produce those children, who don't have the luxury of going to a school of education, of adopting the language of educators, and being able to show up and advocate for her babies in the way that I'm now equipped to,
Right.
Is a reflection of her surviving.
Yeah.
And one could argue that her not being a more active member of the PTA, or not being more disruptive, or not doing any number of things is a reflection of her perpetuating the status quo. That's what I'm leaning into and wanting to trouble that story being told. It shouldn't be told, right? Like that's how we got to the myth around the welfare queen.
Yeah.
Individuals who have elected to assume positions of leadership, right? Educators, school board members, elected or appointed officials, leaders of community-based organizations, people who who purport to care about the well-being of individuals, families, and communities are obligated to do better.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm real clear, right? You cannot purport to care about Black people and not care about and be a Black feminist or care about Black queer people. And I will call people out. That's a part of my job. It's a part of my constitution. But that, again, is specific to people who have adopted a particular role or show up in the world in a particular way, not just Black folks who are trying to survive. That in and of itself is a job.
Yeah. No, I totally understand and get that. I think I was talking about individuals who, as you said, elected to lead things. Like you are leading and creating this space. I forgot who it was. It probably was like Issa Rae show or another show where they were like, why do Black people just always got to be excellent? Like, why we just can't like just be like.
That sounds like Issa Rae.
Yeah, I don't know. It was somewhere, but you're probably right. And that really like resonated. I was just like, wow, like that's true. Like why can't we just survive? Like I'm good. Like
can't just be.
Yeah.
Not survive because again, survive is a reflection of what exists as a result of racism. We get to survive while white people get to thrive.
Yeah.
Right. Like the bare minimum or the maximum for us when we get to go to therapy, if we go, is like, what coping mechanisms can you adopt just to get through, just to show up in your racist ass job, your toxic relationships, your whatever. The goal for us should be for Black folks, regardless of how they show up in the world, who they love, what their credit score is, what family they were birthed in, what geographical zip code their life is choices are bound up in as a result of, right? Like we should just be able to be. We should be able to be with the same protections afforded to white folks, the same access to the justice system and the protections that are purported therein. And we should also have the opportunity to thrive.
Definitely. And it wasn't Issa, it was Lena Waithe. I just want to correct that.
They cousin.
Right. Cool. So the first question I think kind of goes with like what we were just talking about from my friend Tyler. She asked the question, what do we do with educators that refuse to leave and find another field, right? And we talked earlier about
Force them,
who.
force them out. We force them out. We
So
force them out.
okay, how do
Parents,
go ahead?
parents and teachers can work together to lobby for teachers who otherwise shouldn't be in classrooms to not be there. And there, to be clear, are barriers, especially in spaces like Chicago, and there exist labor organizations where leaders are not working on behalf of the communities that they're supposed to serve, but we force them out. In particular, as educators, we call them out. We highlight the ways in which they are engaging in educational malpractice.
Yeah.
We work with advocacy organizations like MBJC or the NAACP to establish campaigns to get them removed. Whatever. Here's my thing.
Yeah.
People, Black folks in particular, know how to address a grievance. Generally, your order is wrong at a store. Your customer service ain't right the way that it should be. Somebody ain't doing what you paid for. You know how to ask for management. You know how to be litigious.
Yeah.
You know how to build a case. We can do the same when it comes to advocating for adults who demonstrate that they don't want to be in our classrooms to be ushered out.
Yeah, that's true, and I think it is incumbent upon community organizations, like you were saying, that for parents who are unsure how to navigate that space, to be able to give them the tools to do that and not speak on their behalf. I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about what you said earlier was about your role was highlighting and creating a space for students to speak, right? So I think similarly, when we think about either teachers or community organizations, to create a stage for parents to talk about and speak about those very exact things that are frustrating them or that they're not meeting the needs. I love that education malpractice. I'm definitely going to use that. That's pretty dope. Cool. I mean, I have truly enjoyed this conversation. I have one question for you about one of the books that you mentioned, Love from the Vortex. Who was that author, and what was the theory that you mentioned?
Yolanda Celie Ruiz.
Okay.
Everyone should find her, follow her, love on her. She is an amazing researcher, educator, scholar, practitioner at Columbia University. And her work is based around critical humility. Love from the Vortex is a collection of poems, but the work, as relevant to the question, is around critical humility. And critical humility acknowledges that the workforce, the K-12 workforce, is primarily right now comprised of white women who have a really challenging time acknowledging their privilege and the ways in which their whiteness and their femaleness protects them in ways that nobody else has access to. And so what it does is allow not only white women, but I'm using them as an example because they're most relevant in this context, to be able to accept and appreciate that and hold that while also doing the work so that they can otherwise be culture responsive, to adopt an understanding of American history and racism and the collusion of racism and poverty to affect the way that teachers experience and judge and set up classrooms and systems to penalize and oppress Black kids, as an example. Super dope sister, powerful work. Anybody who's interested in this work should look her up.
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely going to send these out after this conversation to folks just so that they can continue to develop. I'm curious, as we close, your work with the National Black Justice Coalition, what work do you guys do to support educational spaces in doing some of this work? Is that even you all's lane? And if not, how do you all support other organizations who are doing that?
Yeah, so because education as an institution is a reflection of the societies within which they are operating, the answer is everything we do affects what happens to kids in schools, right? So much of the work of the NBJC is about normalizing and highlighting issues that are otherwise neglected and ignored, right? And so talking about the experiences of kids like Nigel Shelby, having campaigns where we have folks like Angela Rye, Phaedra Parks, and Miss Lawrence and others raised Nigel's name in the way that people are now doing for Ahmaud Arbery, and the way that people did for Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin is a critical part of our work. I am also a researcher. The work that I do using data to highlight how power and race and sexual identity work to penalize students, Black queer students in schools in particular, is really anchored in the history of NBJC. I'm doing cultural competence work with teachers, right? And so for 10 years before I came to the organization, NBJC worked with mostly HBCUs. A lot of this grew out of, some people might remember the name Robert Champion, a drum major at Florida A&M University, shout out to all the Rattlers, who was beaten or hazed and killed for being Black and gay, right? And so a part of what happened in response to the death of Robert Champion was working with Florida A&M, the university leadership, and in particular to acknowledge that Black queer students have always existed at HBCU campuses, even if we didn't want to name them or use the language. And in the same way that we acknowledge and appreciate that the experience of young families or young mothers or pregnant students or students from other countries sometimes warrant additional needs and resources. The same should be said for LGBTQ students. And so since my leadership of the organization, that work has deepened in the HBCU space and in the post-secondary space, but we've also expanded in the pre-K-12 space, right? And so a lot of our work now not only includes the cultural competence work that I mentioned before, helping people to think about setting up classrooms, to appreciate and celebrate difference, but it also includes us working with some of those associations and other individual leaders to respond to the challenges that our babies experience and face. We were really excited before COVID to relaunch a version of those summits I mentioned. The thing that I was really proud about connected to the Obama White House legacy. We actually had our first summit planned in New York with New York City Men's Teach. It was supposed to happen the last week of March, and COVID has derailed that, right? And so a lot of our work now has shifted to meeting, again, the mental health needs of young people, responding to food insecurities, housing insecurities. A lot of young, more than 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ, right? And so responding to immediate needs, and then otherwise so that young people are able to advocate for things they need themselves is where we're focusing our energy. So super excited. We're going to be publishing an op-ed written by a young Black, Latinx, trans sister who is brilliant, who's really highlighting the reality that, for trans folks, most of their experience is that of isolation. And few people take or appreciate rather that their chosen family, the people that they get to build with, is often a source of strength and survival. And in this moment, a lot of people don't have access to computers or broadband or the time and space to sit and do this. And so a lot of our work is and a lot of my work, whether it's at NBJC or in the White House or in the classroom, is about filling gaps and highlighting needs and otherwise helping people connect to the resources they need in order to be, and then at some point so that they can thrive.
Yeah, thank you so much for the work that you all are doing. I think back to the type of leaders and Black people that I needed to see when I was younger in school, and definitely applaud you for the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for joining us today on this conversation. I learned a lot. I'm definitely going to look up some of these books and authors that you mentioned, as well as share them with the individuals who joined us today. I'm going to close this out and stick around and wrap real quick at the end.
Yeah, and then folks can follow me too at 8 o'clock at Mr. David Johns on Instagram Live. I'm going to be talking with Ben Crump about Breonna Taylor, Nigel Shelby, and Ahmaud Arbery. We got about a half hour because he's got a breaking interview, but folks can continue the discussion there.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right, y'all. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. This was an amazing conversation. Truly enjoyed it. I hope that you learned a lot. I'm going to share out all the books and articles that David discussed in the conversation really quickly want to highlight some of the amazing speakers that we're going to have for the remainder of this month. Dr. Maury Sweeney, Chief Equity Officer for Chicago Public Schools, Dr. Christina from the Erickson Institute, Robert and Tamisha, both from Boston, Massachusetts, doing amazing work there for educators and students of color. Thank you all again. Have a great rest of your evening and stay home and stay safe, y'all. Bye.